That's good worship. If you would find the book of Matthew, the 5th chapter, we are going to jump back into the Sermon on the Mount. And just to put it blindly, we're jumping into the deep end. We're going into some really complicated, difficult sort of things, and they're a part of it. You'll remember from 3 weeks ago, we started a passage in the Sermon on the Mount in which Jesus said, I did not come to do away with the law, but to fill it up. And then he proceeds, and there are 7 statements that Jesus makes. You have heard it said, and he goes back to the Old Testament. He pulls out 7 statements. And then he expands on those statements. And where we began 3 weeks ago was, you shall not murder. And basically he said, no, you shouldn't kill people. You shouldn't murder people. But he also went to say, but also that means you need to treat every person with respect. If God created and gave them the life that they have, not only should you not take it, you should respect them. You need to not look down on them. You need to not treat them with disdain, arrogance. You need to treat every individual as created by a gift from God. Well, that's the first one. These next 3 are all kind of connected. There's a couple more, but these 3 are connected, and they all seem to have to do with marriage. And basically, want to kind of tell you those 3 real quickly. The first one is adultery. And he says, adultery is not good because it breaks at the heart of faithfulness, and God is faithful. He's going to go on and he's going to say something that the heart of adultery is not the action, it's the thought and the look that leads you to that action. Then he's going to say divorce is not good. And he's going to talk a little bit more about it, but I think what he's really going to say is the problem with divorce is that it's because people very often are not taking marriage as seriously as they ought to and understanding it as the gift of God. And then he's going to get to the last one, which is taking an oath. And he says, if you make a promise, if you take a vow, if you make an oath, keep it. And don't be fancy about trying to impress people. Just if you say yes, then do what you say you're going to do. And if you say you're not going to do something, then don't do it. Now, those are the basic things. And in the instant that we're going to look at this, Jesus is going to set some really high standards. And quite honestly, this is one of those sermons where most of us, not just many of us, but most of us are going to say, yeah, I've had a problem there. There's something in my past that, most of us are going to have that. But today I also want to remind you, before we get too far into it, that Jesus sets the standard, but then I want to remind you of how Jesus deals with people. And there are 3 stories that I just need to remind you of. For instance, Jesus talks about adultery, but then I want to remind you there was a woman that was brought to him who had been caught in adultery. And the Old Testament law said adultery is so destructive, so bad for families and for society, that somebody caught in adultery is supposed to be stoned. And so they were bringing stones, and they said, Jesus, should we stone this woman? Because that's what Moses said. And you remember what Jesus did. He wrote in the dust, and then he said, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. And then they all left. And Jesus said to the woman, I don't condemn you either. But then he said, go and sin no more. So in other words, Jesus wasn't really so much worried about her past as he was worried about her present and her future. And he met her right where she was and said, I want your future to be different. As far as divorce, there was another woman that Jesus met at a well. She'd had 5 husbands, so we assume she'd been divorced 5 times. And we don't know the circumstances. We also know that the man she was living with at that time was really not her husband. By the way, when you get a wedding license, I've done about 500 weddings, thereabouts. When you get a wedding license, it tells you what number of divorce and what number of marriage it is. I actually had a couple one time. She had been married 8 times, and he had been married 7. I married him anyway. I wasn't too confident it was going to last, but that, they were set to go. So, well, yeah, something like that. But so Jesus met this woman, and understand that he wants to talk about her living water, but he did not just forget the fact that she had these things in her past. But when she left that encounter with Jesus and she got back to her village, her life was different. And Jesus is in the business of taking people where they are and moving them on. As far as your word and keeping your word, you remember one of his own disciples very belligerently said, I'll never deny you. All these other disciples, looking at them, they will probably, but I will never deny you. And by the next morning, Peter had denied Jesus 3 times, and he had not kept his word. And there's one of those really amazing pictures when Jesus meets Peter on the seashore after the resurrection. And Peter's embarrassed. He's ashamed of his past. He's embarrassed of his failures. And Jesus says, do you love me, Peter? And then he pretty much says, Peter, I know about your past. It's time for you to go back to work. So I want you to understand, Jesus sets really high standards, but he is also a Savior of grace who meets us where we are and moves us on. Now, in this passage, let's just go ahead and read it. Starting in chapter 5, beginning in verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman, and by the way, I think it goes both ways in terms of gender, but this is the way he said it. Everyone who looks at a woman with a lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than that the whole body be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but you shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, by the earth, for it is his footstool, by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Do not take an oath by your head. You cannot change one or make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. Now, those 3 are all kind of tied together, and interestingly enough, they all really do kind of talk about marriage. So very quickly, let me just give you the basic picture of marriage from a biblical standpoint. It is, first of all, that God created man and woman, created them to be able to have a relationship together, and had some very specific ideas. Some people, God has actually given the gift to be single. And it is a gift, and it's not something that everybody receives, but some people have that ability, have that gift to be single. But God created men and women. He gave them the ability to complete one another. He gave them the ability to come together. And the beginning of it is always a vow. It was always a commitment. There's something very significant in every element of history and society, everything we've ever looked at in our world. Marriage is understood to be a commitment between a man and a woman. They make that commitment to one another. So first of all, there's this saying something. And then understand that God created men and women differently, and He's the one who created the gift of intimacy. He made it to be something very special. He made it to be very good. He made it to bring about children into the world, but He also made it to help 2 to become 1. He helps it to be an accent to the relationship that a man and woman have. He invented it to be very special and very positive, and He made it to be a blessing and a gift, but He said there's certain conditions that you ought to use that gift in. That if you really want marriage to be the best that it can be, He says, wait until you make the commitment to have sex. And then once you make the commitment, keep that gift of intimacy within the marriage and don't take it outside of the marriage. And once you've made the vow, faithfulness is the picture of the way God commits Himself to us and says He will always be faithful. So faithfulness in the marriage ought to be for all of your life. Now, that's the picture for marriage. Not very many marriages are perfect. Don't know of any, as a matter of fact. But there are some basic things that he talks about in this passage that we just have to address. And so, let's begin. So first of all, he talks about adultery. And by the way, in the Old Testament, there is a separate word for sex before you get married. King James says fornication, but it's a different word. And then there's another word for sex once you're married and you have it with somebody you're not supposed to. In the New Testament, for the most part, the word for adultery basically means sexual immorality. It's having sex in a time when you're not supposed to. It's sex outside of the marriage relationship. And he says that's not a good thing. And it's not a good thing because it takes this wonderful picture of marriage, which is the faithfulness of God and His commitment to us, and it gives a corrupt picture of it. And there's always a damage that occurs. There's always something that tarnishes what marriage can be. And so he says adultery is not good, but it's not the act where the problem begins. The problem begins in the mind when you look and when you begin to consider. And by the way, it's not the casual, oh, well, he's really nice, he's attractive, she's good looking. It's not that simple thought that runs through your mind. It is an idea that's in your mind and you hold on to it. And you turn it over in your mind and you begin to consider it and you begin to think about it. It's the kind of situation where we suddenly realize that we are texting somebody we ought not to be texting that much. Or we're on websites that we ought not really to be on. Or we're having conversations at work with somebody that we really shouldn't be having conversations with. Or maybe there's certain phone calls, or we're meeting someone, or we're thinking about it, and we're playing it out in our mind to the point that we've gone too far. And basically, what Jesus would say is, stop it. You're going down a road that's going to take you someplace that it's going to hurt you and everyone else that you know, and in the end, rob you of the blessing that marriage can be. So that's part of it. But he also says you need to be drastic about this. I don't think he really wants you to pull out your eye. I don't think he... By the way, I know of a story of someone who actually tried to cut their arm off. I don't think he really wants you to do that, but the drasticness of that language says adultery is going to take you someplace you really ought not to be. You need to be going another direction. You need to be avoiding that website. You need to be avoiding that person. Actually, I've talked to an individual who actually quit their job and took a different job because they were in a situation where temptation has gotten so great, there was the danger of them being unfaithful in their marriage. You need to avoid it. You need to go in the opposite direction. And let me suggest to you, one of the great biblical principles is that you overcome evil with good. And if you are being tempted to go in places that you shouldn't be going, then turn around and start spending time with your spouse. Start spending time with the one you're married to. Invest time in your marriage. Invest energy in your marriage. And that time you've been thinking about being in other places, bring it back home where you ought to be spending time. And so he says adultery is a problem and you need to... This is an Andy Griffith thing. I know that's really old. Barney Fife, nip it in the bud. Have you heard that? Anyway, it means stop it before it gets started. And that's kind of the reminder that he gives us about adultery. But he knows that adultery is connected to divorce. So he goes on and he says, you've heard it said, don't get divorced. Well, actually, what he says, and he refers to, it's Deuteronomy, I think about 12. Anyway, Moses gave a command. And he said... And by the way, in those days, women could not initiate a divorce. Men were the only ones who could legally initiate a divorce. But I will tell you, adultery can go both directions, and divorce can go both directions. And so today, everybody needs to hear this. But the law at that time from Moses was, if your wife you find no favor with, or find indecency in her, give her a bill of divorcement. And basically what it was, all you had to do is get divorced, was you got a piece of paper that said, I divorce you, and hand it to your wife. And kick her out. If you couldn't write, actually they had another way. You could take your wife to the city gates, and then in front of two witnesses say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, and she was gone. But then the real issue came, this phrase, no favor with you. And the rabbis debated for great length, what did it mean, no favor or indecency? And they really held on to no favor. And in the days of Jesus, at least among the Jews, the Romans were pretty lax on divorce, so were the Greeks, but the Jews in particular, they got to the place that no favor could mean something as simple as, my wife's not as attractive as she used to be, so I trade her in and get somebody younger. They even had, if you don't like her cooking, you don't find favor, then let her go. She burns your food, let her go. I mean, Basically, Jesus said that kind of thinking about marriage and divorce is not God's plan. That doesn't go to this idea of making a commitment and being faithful to it. And so he said, listen, all these silly things that you might use as a reason for divorce, those really don't qualify. Those really don't count. And so he goes on and he says, in fact, if you're even thinking about divorce and you're not thinking about the fact that there has been sexual immorality, and by the way, the word is not once, it's a repeated word. I mean, if it's not a person who's been sexually immoral over and over and over again, you ought not to be thinking about it. And quite honestly, in the Sermon on the Mount, is there anything about forgiveness? Oh, and by the way, I know some families, and adultery is one of the hardest things for a marriage, but I know some couples who have overcome that. In fact, it is one of the greatest examples of grace, and they are able to move beyond that, and sometimes God is just that gracious, and sometimes that can even happen. But the bottom line is what Jesus is saying, take marriage seriously. Take it serious from the beginning, and once you're in it, take it seriously, and don't be just looking for something else on the other side just because things are tough. Stay in the marriage and keep working as long and hard as you can. But then he goes on, and he does talk about this remarriage thing, and it's kind of complicated. Basically, it's a little bit of sense that, and if you're just going to divorce your wife for any old thing, basically, that's kind of not marriage at all. That's adultery, the way it was to begin with. And for most women in those days, they couldn't really live on their own. Today, a woman can live on her own and do pretty well and have a job. It wasn't that way in that world. And so frankly, if she got divorced and the husband kicked her out, she had to go and find somebody else. And basically, he said, that's not my idea, nor is that God's idea of what marriage ought to be. Now, let me say a couple things. I do perform weddings for people who have been married before, been divorced. There are some pastors who won't do that because of this passage. I do that. Part of it is because over my years of ministry, I have seen some amazing couples that God has blessed and worked in their lives. After a failure in a previous marriage, they have gotten married, and I mean, God has just used them in phenomenal, amazing ways. Now, I will tell you, I don't know if you know, book of Malachi says, God hates divorce. I've never met anybody who's been divorced who thought it was really exciting. In fact, everybody I've known who's had to be through a divorce have said, yeah, I really wish this had never happened. I wish we hadn't been down this road. I wish I hadn't made this decision. In fact, usually there's a whole lot of decisions in that process that you wish you hadn't made. But God doesn't like divorce, and nobody that I know likes divorce. And so you need to be very cautious about it. And yet, I will also tell you, not very often, but there are times when I have suggested to people that divorce was probably the right thing. For a couple reasons. One, it does take two people to be married, and you cannot be married to someone who does not want to be married to you. And very often it happens that you are married and the person you are married to wants to leave. And you do everything you can, and sometimes you have to let them go. Secondly, I don't think that God ever expects anybody to stay in a marriage where they are not safe, where there is abuse, where there is a toxicness, where there is life that is not pleasing to God, and what's happening in the marriage is not even remotely close to what God intends for marriage to be. And there are times when a marriage needs to come to an end. He says, and frankly, much divorce, usually if you back up, there's some neglect. There's some situation in which the best they had to give was not always given to the marriage. And that's a very likelihood. So he talks about adultery. He talks about divorce. He talks about an oath. And this is really bizarre. It's the idea of you say, I'm going to do something. And then the oath was what you added on to the end to impress people with how serious you were. I'm going to give you $100 next Tuesday. And I swear that I'm going to do it by God in heaven, by the hairs on my head, by the hairs on my grandchildren's head, by the souls of my children. If I'm lying, I'm dying. I promise I'm going to do it. Well, they even got really bizarre where they had ways that they would make oaths, and if you made them, some of them were actually binding, and if you said them differently, they weren't binding. It's kind of like, well, I had my fingers crossed. And pretty much Jesus said, that's all dishonesty. What you need to do is, I'm going to pay you, and if you say you're going to pay somebody, you pay them. If you say you're going to do something, you do it. If you say you're not going to do something, you don't do it. And in this context, if you say, I take you to be my lawful wedded husband, I take you to be my lawful wedded wife, you don't say those words casually, and when you say them, you do everything within your power to keep those words because they are your words. So if you put all this kind of stuff together, you remember Jesus paints some really stark realities. But what's at stake is the blessing. That God creates marriage, and He wants it to be a fabulous experience. He wants it to be the very best thing in your life. And today, in the first service, and we'll do it later here, we talked about how many people in our church have been married 50 years or more. We have one couple in our church who have been married 70 years. I want to tell you, there is some blessing when marriage gets done right. When people trust God and do it His way, it is one of the most phenomenal blessings. And if we try and take it from less than what God wants, we put that blessing at risk. And so Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, says, here's what you need to do. So today, let me just make some conclusions, all of this. If you're not married, wait until you get married to have sex. God will bless that. If you already had sex and you're not married, think about waiting from this moment on, because God's in the business of taking where you are and He can bless you. If you're thinking about marriage, take it very seriously. We got some folks, they're up there and you guys are over here. Anyway, if you're thinking about marriage, take it very seriously. It is not a casual thing. And doing it the right way makes all the difference. If you're living together without the vow, then you need to think about that. That's what Jesus would say. That vow, that making the oath, as far as He's concerned, is pretty important. If you're married and you're being unfaithful, in deed or in mind, if you're involved in that relationship, that thinking, you're on that road that you know is going to take you eventually to the end, then stop it. And when you stop it, turn around and invest in your marriage. If you're married and not giving your best to your marriage today, and by the way, there are no perfect couples, and every couple go through seasons of time where we get selfish, where we get distracted, where we're not giving our best. If that's the case, then I want to tell you, invest in your marriage. I don't know what kind of return you get on CDs or mutual funds, but I want to tell you, you invest in your marriage. You invest in your wife or your husband. If you invest in the time that you spend together, that has the greatest blessing. And someday, years from now, regardless of your financial net worth, the blessing of greatest life will be your marriage. Invest in it. If you're in a subsequent marriage, in other words, it's not your first marriage, you're in a second marriage or wherever that may be, then determine that that is going to be the best marriage you've ever been in and that you are going to make it last, and it's going to be the last marriage of your life, and you're going to make it the very best that can be. And here's, I guess, the final word. Wherever you are today in this marriage thing, wherever you are in anything, Jesus wants to meet you right here today. And He's not going to play games about the past. He knows about the past. And you may have to address it, and you may have to ask forgiveness for things in the past, but what He really cares about is this moment and then tomorrow. And it may be that He says, go and sin no more. Or maybe He says, go back to your village and, hey, I want you to be a different person. Or maybe that I know where you've been, but it's time for you to start serving God the way you did in the past, before things in the past, but He's in the business of finding you right where you are, and He says, I care about tomorrow. And when it comes to marriage, I want you to have every blessing that I can make and I can provide, but I want you to put in a position to receive it. Now, just so far, has this been a really fun sermon? I'm not sure about fun or not, but I do convince you that God knows what He's talking about. And our invitation to Him is trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus. And I will just tell you, of all of the things when it comes to families and when it comes to marriage, if you really want the joy of the Lord and you want His happiness and you want it in its full measure, you got to trust Him and understand that when He says this is the way to do it, He knows what He's talking about. So let's stand and let's sing today.